Chapter 20. Dark Horse Riding. Betrayal is the only truth that sticks. Arthur Miller. Delwyn rolled over, leaning away from Heimdall, and reached for the half-smoked joint. She struck a match and lit it. She had to pull hard on it. The weed was still a bit wet, the taste harsh. They'd started growing the plants a few years ago. They had the slaves tend it, along with working the meth lab, and America Reborn had a decent, honest income going now that the Reformation was spreading. The Reformation, however, was a double-edged sword. With a return to normal life, or some semblance of normalcy, the demand for drugs that America Reborn had become so good at supplying had begun to climb. However, the ways in which they produced the products, namely using the slaves, was beginning to garner the wrong sort of attention. The raids, something that had diminished significantly in the last year as more and more of the localities began to solidify their loyalties with the Allied South, were also attracting the wrong sort of attention from militias and local governments reforming to the east. The group had begun as a few remnants of military units in the region and slowly evolved into a large governmental unit with tentacles in nearly all of the larger towns and cities that stretched through Louisiana, Arkansas, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, South Carolina, and the eastern edge of Texas. Soon, America Reborn would have to give up the slaves and possibly move to a different part of the country if things continued on their current trend. It wasn't time to close up shop, though. The demand for drugs was higher than it had ever been before. It seemed like everyone needed an escape from reality at some time or another. Heimdall's acne had faded over the past 10 years, but the scars remained. So, it seemed, had his lovesick obsession for her. He'd had it bad since they were kids, always following after her, with his greasy, lank blonde hair, the occasional whopper of a bruise from his volatile, alcoholic mother, always volunteering to go on guard duty with her. When she had first pulled him aside in the woods after a mission a few months ago, he had been surprised, but responsive. He wasn't a bad lay, she mused. He had been attentive to her needs, something that Cooper never was, and had kept his mouth shut about it, something she needed him to do until the time was right. When the first encounter hadn't produced the desired outcome, she had pulled him aside again. Later, she had done it for fun, even after she was sure. Getting pregnant was her insurance policy, and finding a guy like Heimdall, all muscle, not much brains, was essential. Delwyn's father, Solwyn, had made a big mistake. Despite all of her hard work, her dedication to proving to her father that she could lead, he had given the reins of power to Cooper. But that was about to change for Solwyn and Cooper both. While Scott Cooper had never truly liked her, or even trusted her, over the years she had learned to read him better than anyone. Delwyn knew he was planning something, and it probably had to do with taking Solwyn out of power permanently. Cooper wasn't the type to take orders. From what he said of his time with the Western Front, he had made a determined and calculated effort to kill his way to the top, and she knew it was just a matter of time before he took her old man out, and probably her as well. Delwyn had her own ideas about who should be in charge, and after years of being ignored or marginalized by her father, just because she had breasts and baby-making equipment instead of a dick and balls, well, it was time for a change. She smiled to herself, her homely face curving. Solwyn had made a big mistake underestimating her. So had Cooper, for that matter. And she was nearly ready to give them both what they so richly deserved. Just a month more, and she would enter into her second trimester. Her father would be dead. Cooper would either be dead or on the run, and she would hold the scepter of power in her hands. Heimdall reached out and caressed her hip. His hand was rough with calluses, but he had a gentle touch. Delwyn handed him the joint and was about to reciprocate when there was a scratch at the door. "Shit!" she whispered, grabbing for her clothes. They had used Heimdall's cabin for their tryst, and she felt stupid for allowing herself to relax. Who could have followed them? Was it Cooper, or one of Solwyn's cronies? Behind her, Heimdall stubbed out the joint and was hurriedly pulling on a pair of pants. He went to the door first, easing it open, and then opened it all of the way to the person standing on the other side. It turned out to be Sully, Delwyn's 6-year-old daughter, looking every inch of her father. She was a pretty girl with ice blue eyes and black hair, just like Cooper. The girl was quiet, reserved, her intelligence kept hidden from most. With neither of her parents particularly interested in her, she had naturally gravitated toward her grandfather, Solwyn, after Camellia had died in the outbreak of dysentery that had halved the ranks of America Reborn 4 months ago. Camellia had become nursemaid to Sully a few months after her birth, just as Camellia was weaning Armando. Delwyn hadn't had enough patience to nurse for long, and with no formula, there hadn't been any other real option. Long after the child was weaned, Sully had stuck close, as if sensing that Camellia cared more for her than her own parents did. Camellia had found it ironic, the similarities between the two children who were, after all, half-siblings. They were the only children in the camp, and Armando and Sully did everything together, something that was often frowned upon by the America Reborn leaders, yet no one challenged it. No one wanted to take care of a small child, but it had all changed when Camellia died. Delwyn and others blamed the Hispanic woman for the disease, despite the fact that several members of the AR had sickened first, and inevitably transmitted the dysentery to their one and only doctor. Alanush, who had studied for several years under Camellia, had gotten sick as well and died just 2 days after the Hispanic woman, leaving no one with any medical knowledge. The Reformation's tentacles were spreading, though, and the group hadn't had any major illnesses since the dysentery's spread had been halted. There was a town a few miles away that still turned a blind eye to the group's unsavory aspects, and no small part thanks to the mayor and his town council, who were happy to indulge in the AR's samples of meth and weed. They had a doctor available if the AR suffered another medical emergency. Sully had missed Camellia deeply, but she said nothing. Even at the age of 6, she could see the way of things. She feared her father, avoided her mother whenever possible, but had found a small measure of kindness from her grandfather Solwyn. She stood at the door, understanding on a level that belied her years that her mother was engaged in something she wished hidden. "Grandpa's looking for you," she told her mother, staring at the dirty wood floor of the cabin. Delwyn nodded to her daughter. "Go to the woods out back. Stay there and pick some of them greens. Don't come back until you have a good armful. If anyone asks, I was there picking and gave 'em to you to take over." She said it tersely and stared at the girl until she nodded and ran towards the woods. After the girl disappeared, Delwyn shut the door, finished dressing, and grabbed a handful of mint from a patch growing near the cabin to chew on and stuff in her pockets. It wouldn't do for Solwyn to smell either of her 2 sins on her. He knew what a bastard Cooper was, but had told her many times over the years, "You made your bed, girl. Now you are going to damn well lie in it." Having an affair with Heimdall, no matter how careful they were or how uninterested Cooper was in her, he hadn't slept with her in well over 2 years, was simply unacceptable in her father's eyes. And as for the weed, Her old man thought it was all well and fine for others, for the weak ones to do that, but heaven help her if he caught her at it. Her mother had been a crack whore on the avenues. Selwyn reminded her of it time and again. She was weak and stupid and wanton, and I did what I could to save her from herself. Her mother died when Delwyn was a baby, long before she had held the name of Delwyn Kingmaker. When she arrived at the central cabin, a large meeting room that doubled as their communal dining area, she watched the old man carefully. He had sent the one lone guard away, and he was looking bad, sipping at the tea she had begun lacing with belladonna months ago, his skin pale and sweaty, his pupils large. He blinked when the door opened, letting in a surge of light, and turned away. The light hurt his eyes, and Delwyn couldn't help but smile. He was steadily worsening. Selwyn was alone in the dark room. He barely glanced her way when she shut the door behind her and advanced toward her father. The older man's hand shook as he waved her closer. You kept me waiting a bit, girl. Where were you, anyway? His speech was slurred, and he compulsively licked his lips. Picking greens, sir. She answered him promptly, in the way he expected her to. He lifted the cup of tea. It settled his nerves, at least for a while, which seemed shot these days. He hated watching his fingers shake, the cup slopping liquid out as he brought it unsteadily to his lips. It seemed to him as if he was always thirsty these days and tired, so tired. The dreams were the worst. Waking nightmares of the collapse, but different. Instead of human beings, the military were actually monsters, hiding in their uniforms, pretending to be saviors, and instead eating their victims alive. I need that damned slave woman to come attend to me, he said, slurping at the tea and trying to ignore the stabbing pain in his head. Delwyn wondered if she had made the last batch too strong. Selwyn was degrading fast. Camellia, she said, and tried to think fast. She's off with Cooper on a raid, don't you remember? Now was not the time to remind him that the spick had been dead for months. Her old man blinked, confusion filling his haggard face. A raid? Yes, sir. You said Cooper couldn't be trusted, and neither could that colored woman, so you sent them both off on a raid. You said Cooper wanted to kill you, remember? His jaw was slack, his eyes confused, and he reached up one hand to his head. Everything was so confusing these days, like some kind of waking nightmare. Delwyn looked at her father and realized it was now or never. He was suffering deeply from the effects of the drug, and he was now susceptible to her influence as he never would have been otherwise. She knelt down beside him and began to whisper quietly in her father's ear.